Charlie Kirk, I know that's not off to a good start. He went over to Cambridge, and Charlie Kirk likes going into environments where he talks to a lot of young people, getting into politics, who are very energetic. So they're going to go into a conversation with them, be very passionate, good for cameras. But also, what is typical of somebody who's quite young going through college is this isn't always the case. Of course, every once in a while, Charlie will run into a real roadblock of a student, somebody who can stand on business when it comes to their beliefs. They know what they're saying, stuff like that. But in most instances, they're people who are still formulating what they believe, or if they believe something, they're still trying to figure out exactly, the best foundations to support that belief structure. Because not everybody exactly walks through and finds their conclusion. A lot of people end up adopting their parents' beliefs and then try to find structure to support their parents' beliefs. Either way, though, wherever somebody is developmentally in college is probably a lot further behind than Charlie Kirk, who's already years and years and years in to his multi-million-dollar political career, right? At Turning Point USA, on these YouTube channel debates, going out there as a political influencer, getting paid for appearances, that type of stuff. He's been doing that for quite a bit. Problem is, he is talking to somebody here who is not a student, which sometimes students can do quite well too. In this instance, he's gone to Cambridge, which is a learned institution full of sometimes not learned, but in many instances very learned people. And he went back and forth with a professor who took a very laid-back demeanor over there in the United Kingdom. Now, the topic was Ukraine. Mind you, in the United States, I don't know if this reaction from the crowd would be so overwhelming, especially when I think it comes to some historical failures that Charlie shows in this conversation. But this guy's laid-back demeanor and deconstructing the failures of the administration, but specifically of Charlie Kirk's in the administration's position of, oh, Ukraine's a dictator, Ukraine's bad, they're really bad, Russia's bad too, but Ukraine's also bad. And Charlie kind of scrambles around, grabs on the history, and all I would say is this: Charlie Kirk needs to stick to history that he fully knows and understands before jumping into foreign countries, because he's making the same mistake Elon and many other people do once they jump into another country and they read one thing and they just start applying other standards, not knowing that nation's history. And we'll get into why in a moment, but let's watch.
Thank you. A very, very short question. Israel versus Hamas, good guy versus bad guy. Russia versus Ukraine. Who's the good guy and who's the bad guy?
Both are bad, one is worse.
Which way round?
Russia is worse than Ukraine.
Okay, so why haven't we pursued that?
What do you mean?
Well, it seems to me that in the whole of the current US proposition, that Ukraine is being the bad guy.
In what way? We funded Ukraine upwards to $200 billion.
Absolutely. But
we just signed a mineral deal with Ukraine, not Russia.
Yeah, but you are expecting Ukraine to give up 20% of its territory to someone who invaded it.
Well, is Crimea part of Russia or Ukraine?
Ukraine.
That's where we don't agree.
Well, I'm afraid that's part of international treaty. That's not up for grabs.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, hold on. I mean,
what's interesting about this is, I already know the framing Charlie's going to go for. He says, well, how are they going to take it back? Or I doubt he's going to go deep into, I doubt he's going to go deep into any demographic knowledge. I've already watched this before, so that's one reason I doubt it. But also, I doubt it because I doubt he's really spliced the hairs on that. But you can apply a very basic argument. If Russia controls it, it's very hard to take back. Therefore, they control it. But therefore it is Russian is a totally other statement entirely. It is giving it up before the negotiations have concluded. And it kind of shows how, for Israel, Charlie will get out there and he'll get in the trenches and he'll defend their position, defend their right to land, defend against right of return, defend against these things. But when it comes to Ukrainian territorial integrity, it's not even a question of, okay, how about we get the best deal that's possible by maybe negotiating this thing that is rightfully theirs? It's just nope, it's theirs. And that is not going to be received well in the United Kingdom. One of the most, and that's where Cambridge is, of course, one of the most pro Ukraine countries and all of the European Union and in the world, period. Outside of the Baltic states, it's really the United Kingdom.
Even Zelensky has said he's willing to give up Ukraine.
No. America signed the agreement that gave Ukraine Crimea.
Sorry, I forgot. No longer in the EU. I just EU and Europe is kind of so synonymous in my head, and I was dreaming of a better future for Britain. My apologies.
Right.
When the Soviet Union ended.
Right. It was done. First of all, it never should have been done. It was largely ceremonial. But however, it was annexed under Obama. Yes, and it was a mistake, and it should be given back to Russia as a sign of good gesture to end this conflict. Okay. But who's currently controlling Crimea? Where was the Russian Navy head?
As a sign of good gesture to end this conflict, not as, look, we will do formal recognition in return for getting X, Y, or Z back. It's just give it up, sign of good gesture. Could you imagine, like, okay, how about we end the war with Hamas now as a sign of good? Could you imagine just saying this with any other area, sign of good gesture to bring about peace, to bring an end to the conflict? This is just an instance where there's been a bubble on the internet, right, about how to end this war and how the war needs to end and that it's a waste of money, that the causes of the Ukrainian people have, for whatever reason, not socially appealed to those of the right, whether it has to be with the fact that Russia has kind of broadcasted itself as a savior of Christianity, despite its terribly low church attendance rates. Maybe it has to do with the fact that they see a lot of establishment media figures that are in support of it, and so they grow inherently suspicious of it. Maybe it has to do with for some people on the very far right, maybe Zelensky's Jewish heritage, maybe the fact that Ukraine isn't so repressive towards certain types of minority groups. That's not to say they aren't. That's just to say they're not as repressive as raid the gay bar, arrest the homosexual. You can't post on Twitter that being gay is okay. Like, it's not as repressive. For whatever reason, a certain section, and a certain amount, of course, is due to misinformation, but I think that's to be assumed. They've set against it combination of people who just don't care and a combination of people who think they care or misinformed, or people who do care, but quite frankly, I don't agree that invading Ukraine is going to stop homosexuality anywhere, irrespective of the fact that I think it's a dumb idea, or any of this culture war nonsense that people try to attach to, great power struggle. Back to when Jordan Peterson was talking about how this is an outgrowth to the woke, to when I just see the people who end up joining the Russian army, the very few who do from the West, who say they're here to crusade against, woke and cultural Bolshevism, and then get blown up by an FPV. It's very, very sad, but that's the reality. I think Charlie Kirk has been captured by these people. And at the start of the war, he was a lot more, sympathetic towards Ukraine. But as it's gone on, I've listened to him talk about it. And I remember him saying that the Ukrainian people aren't really ready for democracy, that the Ukrainian people hadn't processed a Jeffersonian style democracy in the way that Americans had. So trying to support them, I don't know, it's a little shaky. Mind you, the Ukrainians just protested during wartime, and they made the government reverse course on destroying some anti-corruption independence barriers that stopped them from controlling anti-corruption institutions, which was hard fought after Euromaidan. So that just happened during wartime. So when he says, like, oh, they don't understand, like, the Jeffersonian, like, I don't know if everybody over there read Jefferson, but you don't need to read Jefferson to understand who owns the streets, and it's the people, and people with, with wooden planks and baseball helmets and plastic shields cut out of water barrels understood that enough, even if they weren't Jeffersonian about it. But also, we have the longest running constitution in the history of humankind. It's impossible to say that anybody who's like a pro-democracy advocate isn't in some way influenced by the longest running democratic constitution on the planet.
Quarter than World War II. Where was the end of World War II son? This is very important.
I'm not doubting that. I'm just saying that if we're being logical on what has happened, that you are now arguing against that flow. And I don't understand it. Because actually, why is Ukraine the bad guy?
No, I said they're bad. They're not the bad guy.
Yeah, well, you said they were both bad, but one was more bad
Correct,
than the other.
yes.
So why is Ukraine bad?
Well, there's a lot wrong with Ukraine. First of all, they're not a democracy. Zelensky refuses to hold an election.
Well, no, he can't hold an election.
Oh, wait, did Churchill hold an election during the war?
Because under his constitution...
Hold on, Lincoln held an election during the war. That's not true. He can call an election. He can call a snap election. He's full dictator of the country.
No.
Because he knows that the people...
Now, the one critique I'd make of this professor, and there's no critique else outside of this I could really make of the professor, who I think does well enough. You know, I think the specifics on the Constitution could have been, you know, elaborated on. But I mean, that's just the usual response people throw out. But when it comes to Charlie Kirk talking about having an election during wartime and how it makes Ukraine not a democracy, his first example he goes to before he says Abraham Lincoln, which is the default that most people fall back to as an American, because that's the time we had elections while war was on our soil. It was during the Civil War. He references Winston Churchill. He said, did Churchill have an election? No, he didn't, Charlie. And I think right when he said that, that's when he lost, like, immediately, like 33, a certain percentage of the crowd who must know basic British history. He's at Cambridge. He's at Cambridge, dude. How do you say this at Cambridge? He says, did Churchill have an election? No. Churchill famously, mind you, in British political history, when trying to have an election at the end of the war after holding off elections for the duration of the war to fight against the Nazi menace in Europe, he then lost. He lost big, he lost hard, and then Labour took over. And while I don't want to get into the specifics of British political history, it's not what I'm an expert on, but from what I know from the historians that I've talked to, the consensus is that, you know, the post-war vision did not appeal enough to the British public, while Labour had an idea for the future and for the starting of certain staple British social programs.
Refusalations. People that Finland had to postpone parliamentary elections with a special act in WW2 due to the war.
Thank you for the $5. And that's also true. Finland has also, he didn't reference Finland. I don't know why he would, but Finland is also an example of something like this happening. Mind you, there's also private political signals in Ukraine about what happens when the war ends. And word is, and I can say this because it's not even that much of a secret. I mean, I think even some outlets have reported on it, but people heard about it for a bit, is that Zelensky was telling his staff to get ready for an election. Because if any talk with Putin actually does lead to a ceasefire, then the starting of an election or starting of the election process would basically commence almost immediately. And then they would go through the election. And the Zelensky people want to be ready for when that announcement comes. And since, you know, they would be the ones making the announcement, you know, they could have a certain amount of advantage in preparing for that announcement. Either way, that indicates that they very much do plan to have an election once the war is over, just like Churchill did when he lost. And some people have talked about whether if Valery Zaluzhny, who's one of the most popular figures in Ukraine, even though he has never formally announced he's going to run for office, there's whispers about it because he's one of the people who poll better than Zelensky. And if he ran against Zelensky, he might beat Zelensky. And I fully expect that, considering that the Zelensky government did not feel they had the room to wiggle out of their anti-corruption independence during martial law past curfew in the middle of the night, I certainly don't think that they're going to think they have the political wherewithal that after the cessation of hostilities for whatever period of time, they're going to go and arrest Zaluzhny if they beat him in an election, XYZ. Because if they didn't think they could do that after curfew with this corruption stuff, they're certainly not going to think that after fighting all this for a different Ukraine, something different than Russia, they're just going to fall back on screw it, we lost, but I don't care, arrest him. Point is, like, he's not in a particularly strong position to take that type of authoritarian rule once hostilities cease. During the war, he does have a certain amount of those powers to go further than he would during peacetime. But we have also seen the limitation of those powers due to those protests, because democracy is not as simple as, like, did we have an election today? Do we have an election next week? Is there an election next month, next year, in the next 2 years? That's not all that democracy is. Democracy is about attending to people's social needs once they speak to you, that you're led by the people's will to some capacity, that you're led by what people want. And in Ukraine's instance, in this instance, the vast majority of the people don't want to have elections until the war is over. They see a problem with people in occupied territory not being able to vote. They see a problem with trying to make a structure so many people with mail-in ballots around the world who were displaced as refugees could vote. They see a problem with, of course, the fact that Russia will try to interfere in the election directly. And while I understand Civil War comparisons, the Confederates did not have ballistic cruise missiles that could hit polling stations in Baltimore. They didn't have that. And so that comparison, especially when Ukraine has never held an election under these circumstances before, their system of elections is like roughly 30 years old. To expect them to wait until this hostility is over, if they don't do that, they are now a dictatorship. It is not a democracy worth defending. I think it's not only, it's jumping to conclusions. You're being purposely dishonest. To not acknowledge the huge gulf in difference between the Ukrainian and Russian systems is to be purposefully blind in order to shield yourself from audience capture, or at least the consequences of when audience capture goes bad and you can't say honest things to your audience. When you can't say, hey, yeah, actually, Ukraine is a democracy. It's just that, of course, during war, they were a little more tighter on the controls. Hell, America's a democracy. What happened to the German-American Bund? What happened to the Silver Legion? What happened to these organizations during World War II, which we then started to classify in existential terms, though the war never occurred on American soil outside of the attack on Pearl Harbor and some attack on American controlled islands. But never in the continental U.S. This is a war that has reached Ukraine like deep into its lands, while the Russians are denying that Ukrainians really even exist as a people, or that they should exist as a state. So it is an existential war. So to try to use these circumstances to portray Ukraine as a dictatorship is dishonest.
People of Ukraine would kick him out immediately because he's deeply unpopular. In fact, if he wanted to show it.
So he's saying that if they had an election right now, the Ukrainian people would kick him out immediately because he's deeply unpopular. Why doesn't the polling indicate that? I mean, the opposition, the people who would assumedly take power, whether it's Petro Poroshenko or any of these other people, probably not Petro Poroshenko, but if any of these other people in the opposition who would benefit from an election, because obviously they would get a swing at power. Why are they all saying wait until after hostilities? Maybe because they care if their constituents or their supporters get blown up at a polling station. Maybe it's because they care about the constituents who are currently displaced, who message them on Facebook and say, hey, I want to vote for you, but I have to be back in the country. Or hey, how about maybe they're scared about backlash as seen not unified with the country, since the majority of Ukrainians don't want to have an election. And the majority of Ukrainians, even after the corruption kerfluffle is the nice way to put it, still support Zelensky according to polling. And I wouldn't expect it to be anything worse than a plurality for the immediate future unless there's some big change. So, I mean, it's one thing to say that Zelensky's reelection is not guaranteed. I agree with that. But to say that they hate him and they would kick him out if they had an election, you don't know that. I mean, we've never seen Zelensky run for office before. He was a general. He was the leader of the Ukrainian armed forces during the start of the war. That doesn't necessarily translate into good campaigning. Once he is no longer just, oh, I know him, he's the war hero. He was the guy who was in Siersky the Butcher, which is like the popular conception. And then they're like, oh, wait, he has that opinion? Oh, he has that opinion. Once he has to classify himself and he's not basically a Ukrainian military celebrity and the ambassador to the United Kingdom, which is his current role, things might change. Whatever the ceasefire deal is will ultimately also heavily affect the election. There's going to be many things that affect that election. But to say that like, oh, Zelensky is a dictatorship because if they had an election right now, Zelensky would lose. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know the Ukrainian political reality. He doesn't even know that, Churchill didn't have elections during the Second World War. He doesn't know much about Ukrainian political society whatsoever. He's shooting from the hip here. He just knows that Zelensky won't hold elections. And so in that, he can put whatever interpretation he wants. He can say the Ukrainians don't want him in there and they'd vote him out because that serves him. So that's the intention he can put in there. There's no poll that he's relying on that. I've seen the polling. I talked to people. A lot of people don't even like Zelensky, but would still vote for him over people like Poroshenko or others who they think wouldn't do as good of a job in his position as he's doing right now. There's people who don't like Zelensky and would still vote for him. There's people of different complex political philosophies here. To say that so simply, when even the opposition doesn't know what would happen, I mean, Charlie Kirk must have a lot of knowledge that the Ukrainian political establishment doesn't.
Statement to the world, he would call an election and win by 80% and say, see, I'm super popular. So that's number one. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with a person being propped up as a government we're sending $200 billion to that refuses even to face his voters.
Okay, I can't agree with you factually on that at all.
Okay.
I mean, constitutionally, Ukraine is not able to hold an election because it's under military law at the moment, and that's just a matter of fact.
Again, he can, as a prime minister or president, he can do whatever he wants.
He can't.
Okay, all right, we're going to just go back and
sign an executive order and change their constitution.
Okay.
Neither can the American president either. So
Okay.
hopefully there's a bit of...
He could even do a ceremonial election to see.
A ceremonial election. Hey, everybody, I got an idea. Let's all get in big lines in public places, at places like shopping malls and public centers and city halls across the country for a ceremonial event. Yes, a ceremonial event where we're all just going to say, who's our favorite guy? Ooh, who's going to vote for the Eurovision winner? Ooh, who's going to vote for the... If have an election or don't have an election, don't be like, well, how about a ceremony? No, just say they should either just stick to the thing where they have an election. The idea of a polling place getting people at a polling place getting killed, children being left orphans, so people could ceremonially, like through ceremony, declare if they like Zelensky or not to please Charlie Kirk. Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. The amount of time and effort that would go into organizing this. It's one thing to keep up the democratic standard and to make sure that there's a continuance of government during wartime. It's another thing to just do it in order to please you. Like, I understand like a poll and an election are two different things, but there is not a clamoring in Ukraine for an immediate election. There is a clamoring that once the fighting stops, there should be an immediate election. But let me ask you this question. Here's a great question. In fact, here is a fantastic question for Charlie Tel Aviv Kirk. What about Netanyahu? Don't we all know that as long as this war continues, Netanyahu can delay an election and that there could be a political incentive for him, and not only to please the far-right ministers in his government, but to continue the war, because the continuation of the conflict with Hamas means that he doesn't need to have an election where he might very well lose because he was the security state prime minister and October 7th was a massive security failure. But Charlie Kirk wants to give Israel more aid. Charlie Kirk wants to continue to support Israel. Israel's lack of an election, despite the people's active clamoring for one after Netanyahu's failure and the unpopularity of the government, that does not matter to him. That's not of concern to him. And look, I could tell you, once the war over between Israel and Hamas, once that's over, there'll probably be an election in Israel. Maybe the situation will change, but it's just a double standard he has. It's currently audience captured to be against Ukraine, so he has to hold this double standard. That's the only incentive that I can read out of it, because, I mean, I just don't see how you can be so passionately in support of Israel and hold this. It's perfectly fine for Netanyahu to continue on with this war, not hold an election, despite the people's clamoring, versus in Ukraine when they're actively having the war on their internationally recognized border in their territory, for them to delay an election, despite the opposition's saying, no, we don't want to. For them not to have an election, that is so horrible that we shouldn't support them. We shouldn't give them support. I just don't see it.
Where he actually stands with the people.
I think we call those opinion polls.
Yes, and they're very negative.
Firmly ahead in the opinion.
Again, but you would agree that a person that holds on to power without the...
Did you hear that? Did you hear how quick... This is Charlie Kirk's thing. I don't know if you guys recognize Charlie Kirk's tactics, but if Charlie Kirk fucks up, and this is the... I said that I would only give the professor one critique. This is the only other critique I would give the professor, is when Charlie Kirk messes up, he very quickly readjusted. He switches into gear and he moves away quickly. When he said Winston Churchill, didn't Winston Churchill have elections during wartime? Oh, immediately shifted over to Abraham Lincoln, because the answer is no, he didn't. I don't know if it was just the look in the professor's eyes of, boy, please, no. Or I don't know if it was what it was that made him switch in the gear. But here it is again, where he says that Zelensky would lose. And like the professor's like evidence. And he's like, the opinion polls, which Zelensky is down. And then the professor says, well, Zelensky's up. And then Charlie just moves on. His tactic is to not spend time letting the audience remember moments where he's losing. If he was just get in the ground and fight him over that, and they were to go Google it and show that he was down, well, then that's a big loss for Charlie. But if he just quickly moves on, then that's just like it's like a small hiccup. But you can see it here very quick. It happens quick. It's hard to spot.
We're going to just go back
sign
and
an executive order and change their constitution.
Okay.
Neither can the American president either. So hopefully there's a bit of...
He could even do a ceremonial election to see where he actually stands with the people.
I think we call those opinion polls.
Yes, and they're very negative.
Firmly ahead in the opinion.
Again, but you would agree that a person that holds on to power without the election of the sovereign is pretty questionable.
No, not in those circumstances.
Okay, then we disagree.
No, okay, that's fine. That's fine. But give me another reason why you...
They are the most corrupt country in Europe that never even met the most remote standards of joining NATO.
He's coming to Cambridge with YouTube title, like quick jabs. That's what this is the problem Charlie's having. That's something you say at the start of a YouTube video before. This is what this is. This is what that is. Hey everybody, Ukraine's the most corrupt country in Europe. Surprising? Watch later to find out more. That's the thing you say at the start of the video to drag in the people who are dragging their knuckles. Right? That's what that's for. This is Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is one of the most pro-Ukraine countries in Europe. When you look at polling, they poll basically as good as the Baltics when it comes to supporting Ukraine, right? When it comes to the government, everybody up to including Nigel Farage has said that we have to continue to support Ukraine because Nigel Farage had to read the room and say, yeah, despite his history of Putinism and the fact you should never trust him on the matter. So you're in this environment, and one of their intellectual, like elitist intellectual institutions, and this is what you're delving out. Okay.
Okay, then we disagree.
No, okay, that's fine. That's fine. But give me another reason why you...
They are the most corrupt country in Europe that never even met the most remote standards of joining NATO.
All this dude would have to say is like Viktor Orban, right? This is somebody that Trump's very buddy-buddy with. Trump is angry that the Ukrainians, who he told to increase the pressure on the Russians through the air campaign, who then strikes Russian infrastructure, like energy infrastructure, strikes this pipeline that supports Hungary. Now he's angry at the Ukrainians. Viktor Orban's an incredibly corrupt government. The Viktor Orban government is incredibly corrupt. It's why it's unpopular right now and has one of the highest corruption rates. No, it has the highest corruption rate, public corruption rate in the entire European Union. And Trump's perfectly friendly buddy-buddy with them.
Do you not know where a lot of this money is going?
I don't disagree that there is a problem with corruption, but the most corrupt country in Europe, are you sure about that?
I'd have to double or triple think about that, but they're very corrupt.
It's embarrassing, dude. Why would you, if you go in there and you said Ukraine's incredibly corrupt, you say that, and then people could like have a debate about like, okay, so how is that corruption decreased? How is that corruption? Is the corruption the same as it was? Because then I could talk about like, yeah, corruption isn't as bad as it used to be, but it's still a problem in these areas. The fact that people can pay off SBU officers and XYZ, take your name off the draft rolls, like these are all problems. People can look at the Hostile Military Administration scandal. People can look at the military jacket scandal. We can point out like real corruption cases. We can compare it to the Poroshenko era. We can compare it to the era before Euromaidan. We can have that actual conversation about how Ukraine has had a moderate decrease of corruption, is heading in the right direction, but still has a lot of areas to work on it. Or you can make a cartoon character. You make a cartoon character where Ukraine is basically like a man in a ski mask with like a twirly mustache and a big bag of doubloons, and he's taking it from the American like coffers. If you want to have like a serious discussion about it, have a serious discussion about it. But like most corrupt country in Europe, it immediately collapses. Like, oh, I have to double and triple check that. Why did you say it? You said that Ukraine's bad and Russia's worse. You asked to name two things. One was Ukraine not holding elections during wartime, and then you used Winston Churchill as your example, a leader who did not have elections during wartime. And then your other example was corruption. You say they're the most corrupt country in Europe, then immediately back off of it, not even under pressure. They just asked you to reaffirm the statement you made. This is what happens when Charlie Kirk isn't debating a novice political, like a political scholar at the age of 19 who is like, hey, Mr. Charlie, I think you should be nicer to gay people. It's like, okay, well, what exactly is a woman? Well, I don't really know how to define. You know, that's a little different than this. You're talking to Europeans about European defense policy now.
That's fine. But give me another reason why you...
They are the most corrupt country in Europe that never even met the most remote standards of joining NATO. Do you not know where a lot of this money is going?
I don't disagree that there is a problem with corruption, but the most corrupt country in Europe, are you sure about that?
I'd have to think, I'd have to double or triple think about that, but they're very corrupt.
Okay, so that's a little bit doubtful. It's not absolute.
Well, I mean, well,
would you... There's corruption around. I mean, you know, let's face it, we are talking about comparison with some of the states you're doing business with.
I mean, half of those were laughs and half of those were groans in the room. It felt like some people are just annoyed at him. Another portion is more just snickering at his lack of knowledge, or the fact he would assert something in Cambridge to a professor and then immediately roll back off of it.
We are talking about,
like, this is like the surface level. He just said they're bad, and then he was asked to give reasons, and then could back. These are reasons he's picking. It's not like the Cambridge professor said, justify these points. He's choosing these dialogue trees, and none of them have branches. They're all just bare trees, completely devoid of a single piece of greenery. It's actually quite sad.
comparison with some of the states you're doing business with in the Gulf.
Oh, of course, but we're not giving them money, they're giving us money. That's a difference, right? Saudi Arabia is...
Oh, so it's fine.
Well, hold on a
so
second.
It's morally acceptable to take money from corrupt people.
Well, hold on. First of all, as far as morally acceptable, you do what's best in the benefit of your country. And so, for example, we were allied with Russia during the Second World War, and I'm glad we were. And I would ask you,
don't forget.
How much money is too much money to send to Ukraine? We're at $200 billion right now.
I don't think you have to...
We're not exactly at 200 billion right now, but that's the number that they keep throwing out. Trump said 250. And then at one point, I remember, I could have sworn I heard at some point he was going like 350. Either way, is Charlie calling Trump a liar?
Send any more money to Ukraine.
We agree.
I think you have to agree to support them as a free country and perhaps sell them weapons, like you're very happy to sell weapons to less free countries. And I think Europe will pick up the slack. As we ought to, and I don't disagree with some of the comments about Europe not looking after its own security. I just don't get this approach, which was supposedly to end the war quickly, which now seems to be elongating it, and in doing so, throwing up a smokescreen of very variable facts, if they are facts at all, about how things occurred, which actually isn't helping things. And if people can't see that Putin is stalling, I'm just...
I agree with you. I think he might be stalling.
And therefore, and I think even...
What do you mean might be? What do you mean might be stalling? Might? What do you mean might? Might? There's a question mark? We're going on 9 months. Remember, 24 hours before he even gets inaugurated. 9 months after his inauguration. Putin still hasn't even agreed to meet Zelensky, and Trump's given reason is he doesn't like him. Oh, I think he might be stalling. I agree. This room at Cambridge really better suck up all the knowledge they can out of Charlie Kirk here. I'm really happy he's talking about defense policy. Please tell me about the laurels and the accomplishments of Jeffersonian democracy so I can translate it to the babushkas out in the rural Luhansk region who need Charlie Kirk's teachings. I'm like it's one thing to come in this room and say, I don't care, right? That is an Americana. That is a piece of Americana you can put on the room, okay? I don't care, not our business. That's European nonsense. That is something you've heard during World War I. That's something you heard during World War II. That's something you heard throughout the duration of the Cold War. And it's also a question that was asked by America's historical adversaries, where people ask, hey, would America really, and people, things that European asked, would the French asked, would America sacrifice New York for Paris, right? In an atomic clash. And these question marks were very real. And to have Charlie Kirk come on here and offer this instead of like, why should Americans care? Which I think is a much more, at least historically valid conversation than they didn't have elections during wartime to a British audience. Oh, you know, they're the most corrupt country ever, or not. I don't know. It's sad.
I'm just.
Maybe Putin's stalling. I don't know. Again, why even brush up on this topic? Why even just at this point just say like it's not really my topic. I don't know much about it. It'd be more respectable than this trying to find some way to hit the drum in order to catch the attention of the audience. And like, it's a bad beat, man. It's a bad beat. People aren't digging it.
You can't see that Putin is stalling.
I agree with you. I think he might be stalling.
And therefore, and I think even your president has acknowledged the fact that he thinks he might be stalling.
That's correct. So we don't have a disagreement there.
No, we don't. No,
we just have a disagreement about the efficacy of tactics, and we don't know. And I'm willing to say we could be wrong.
No. Oh well.
Of course, you could be wrong in life.
Yeah.
I mean,
we could all be wrong, but actually bringing that war to an end consistently actually isn't going very well. And I would just suggest to you that whatever tactics have been used are perhaps not the best, and they are certainly inconsistent with what's going on in the Middle East and how America has been treating parties in the Middle East. But I've had enough of your time.
Fair. No, that's a fair contention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now,
I don't need the Phyllis commentary. That's a fair contention. I mean, Charlie couldn't just like call him a dumb. Couldn't just call him like a dumb student. The dude did well. He could have been more aggressive. Maybe it just wasn't in the guy's nature to be more aggressive. Maybe it wasn't just in the guy's nature to be like, look, America should not be sitting on the sidelines in the struggle for freedom. It's one thing to say you don't care. Like, I don't know what exactly he would be aiming at, going a little harder in what direction, but maybe it's just not in his nature. These are not exactly Jubilee debates. This is Cambridge. So you're going to expect maybe a professor at Cambridge is going to be approaching it in a different way than you would expect from somebody who's trying to do a little bit of internet blood sports and to get the best KO clip. But it was very clear that this dude, for the entirety of this conversation, was kind of low-key ranching Charlie Kirk. He almost felt like I don't want to compare Charlie Kirk to a bull. It just doesn't feel like a visual metaphor that aligns with him. But I felt like he was a matador, like wrestling with a guinea pig, and the guinea pig was missing. Either way, like the whole time, it just felt like Charlie was either playing catch up, was either conceding, was saying like, would say something, then back off of it. It seemed like he is probably one of his weakest positions is Ukraine. Listen to this, honestly. And that's not to say that, I agree with his other positions. That's to say that I think this is the area where he probably has the largest vulnerability, where his positions just don't line up when it comes to philosophies of deterrence, that his position when it comes to like not having elections doesn't line up when it comes to other governments. The complaint about corruption doesn't line up when it comes to other governments. His claims about corruption don't line up. The electoral standard would immediately fall apart upon Ukraine's next election. Like, the more I listen to this, the more I think that if somebody got Charlie to sit down in an environment and get him to talk about Ukraine for like 20 minutes to 30, he would either have to completely come out of the mold of his audience capture like a beautiful butterfly, or he would just basically have to like play. He would have to get the Mayweather turtle shell defense, and he would just have to try to like disengage the entire time and pivot out of it, pivot to something else. Because I mean, if this minimal amount of ranching is what I would call it, ranching from the Cambridge professor was enough to deal with Charlie on this. Real pressure on a one-on-one environment for an extended period beyond 5 minutes. Yeah, no, that would be a real problem for the man. Oh, by the way, JD Vance's cousin was Nate Vance was on TV again talking about why Russia will not be a U.S. ally. They like interviewing him. They like putting Nate Vance up on the screen.